Hello and welcome to Astromantic. Today's video is about when Pluto went out of bounds north from 1938 to 1953. In my part 1 video on Pluto's cycles, I showed this line graph of Pluto's 15-year-long out-of-bound north 16 subperiods, beginning in 1938 when Pluto first went out of bounds in that cycle, ending with the last subperiod, the 16th, that ran for 2.5 months in 1953. In this video, I'm going to highlight some of the events that occurred during each of those 16 out-of-bound subperiods and their following inbound periods to illustrate the increasing peril the world was experiencing as Pluto went more and more out of bounds. By the time Pluto reached its highest declination, when it was at its most out-of-bounds position in the 9th subperiod of this cycle, just over halfway through the entire 15 years on April 9th, 1946, the worst had already occurred. As Pluto slowly headed back towards the angle of obliquity for good, the focus was on rebuilding Europe, implementing reforms, and prosecuting those responsible for the horrors of World War II. Even though Pluto's declination gradually decreased over the last half of this cycle, the authoritarian threat and rampant paranoia continued in the form of the Korean War, McCarthyism, and the beginning of the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. Pluto's associated with power and control, remember, and with mass movements and transformation at all levels. Pluto rules degeneration, so everything decaying and rotting, from food to flesh. Pluto also rules the massive destructive energy released in atomic weapons, as well as the transformative processes of life at the subatomic cellular level. Pluto rules the shadow, the bad stuff you repress and suppress that leaks out in projections and temper tantrums. As god of the underworld, Pluto rules bad guys, criminals, the mafia, corrupt fiends who operate secretly in the shadows outside the law. Pluto also rules great wealth. People with strong Plutos by placement or aspect can be obsessive and controlling, and usually enmeshed in power struggles, for good or ill. Before Pluto went out of bounds north for the first time in this cycle in 1938, it had been steadily increasing in declination, getting closer and closer to going over the angle of obliquity. Here on Earth, meanwhile, violence and abuses of power were ramping up, especially by authoritarian dictators. Francisco Franco overthrew the Second Spanish Republic with his military coup in 1936, which led to Spain's Civil War. In the USSR from 1936 to 1938, Joseph Stalin was brutally purging all the dissidents in his country by imprisoning or executing them, anywhere from 700,000 to 1.2 million people in what is now called Stalin's Great Purge. On July 7, 1937, the Second Sino-Japanese War began. This conflict harked back to 1931, when the Japanese staged a false flag operation to justify invading Manchuria and established a Japanese puppet state. For years, Japan and China skirmished back and forth. Then the conflict escalated into a full-blown war when Japan invaded the rest of China in 1937 and continued during World War II, with China being supported by the Allies. Benito Mussolini, meanwhile, had been governing Italy as its fascist dictator since 1922, when the king appointed him prime minister, and Mussolini quickly consolidated power and turned Italy into a totalitarian one-party state. He withdrew Italy from the League of Nations on December 11, 1937. In Germany, Adolf Hitler, who had been in power since 1933, made it mandatory in December 1936 that all boys aged 10 to 18 must join the Hitler Youth. In 1938, Hitler abolished the War Ministry and took command of the German armed forces, right before Pluto went out of bounds. He replaced several top personnel with loyalists who would enable his aggressive military ambitions. He had also by this time built several concentration camps. Pluto went out of bounds north for the first time in this cycle on February 18, 1938, for 3.5 months, till June 1st that year. The next month, in March, Hitler began his territorial expansion with the Anschluss, his annexation of Austria. In Italy, Mussolini finagled equal power to the king over the military. Up till that point, the Italian military had sworn a loyalty oath only to King Victor Emmanuel III. Though the king was widely seen as weak and passive and let Mussolini get away with practically everything, he was reportedly miffed about this latest power grab. In May 1938, Francisco Franco made Catholicism the state religion of Spain and used it to legitimize his ultra-conservative hold on the country and strengthen his authoritarianism by violently eradicating dissidents and secular beliefs through executions and censorship. Franco so identified himself with the church that to defy him was akin to defying religious morality itself. Then Pluto went back inbounds on June 2, 1938, for around 7 months. During this time, on September 30th, 1938, the prime ministers of the UK and France, Neville Chamberlain and Edouard Daladier, flew to Germany to deal with the crisis of the Sudetenland, a portion of Czechoslovakia populated by German speakers that Hitler wanted to annex for Germany. Hitler had been mobilizing to invade the area, which threatened to start another world war, since Poland and Hungary also made territorial demands, and then the Soviet Union got involved, saying they would aid Czechoslovakia. No one wanted another world war, so Chamberlain and Daladier thought the strategy of appeasement was best. Just give Hitler what he wanted to keep the peace. After all, Hitler promised that he would not invade any more countries in Europe. So the two prime ministers and Hitler, along with Mussolini, signed the Munich Agreement, ceding part of Czechoslovakia to Hitler. No one from Czechoslovakia was there or even consulted. Chamberlain flew back to England and was celebrated a hero, with crowds wildly cheering him on for preserving the peace. That goodwill would not last long, however, and the world would soon find out the hard way what a colossal mistake it was to appease a dictator. Germany invaded and occupied the Sudetenland per the Munich Agreement on October 1, 1938. At the same time, Hitler also greatly ramped up his persecution of the Jews, which led to Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, on November 9th and 10th, 1938, a pogrom or violent riot against Jews throughout Nazi Germany. Nazi paramilitary groups, the SS, the SA, and even the Hitler Youth took part in ransacking, smashing, and destroying Jewish businesses and buildings. They also destroyed over 1,400 synagogues and arrested around 30,000 Jews. And then on December 17, 1938, the nuclear age began, when German chemist Otto Hahn discovered the nuclear fission of uranium, for which he won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1944. His work led to the development of atomic bombs and atomic energy. Pluto went out of bounds for its second subperiod on January 27, 1939, for 5 months, till June 26, 1939. 3 days into the second subperiod, on January 30, 1939, Hitler gave his notorious prophecy speech before the Reichstag, the German parliament, in which he predicted the outbreak of war would mean the end of European Jews, or as he put it, the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. He was attempting to justify genocide by convincing Germans in the world of negative Jewish stereotypes and that Jews were anti-German and dangerous to financial stability and national security. On March 15, 1939, Hitler broke the Munich Agreement he'd signed just over 5 months before and annexed Bohemia and Moravia, dissolving the Second Czech Republic. He'd threatened the governments there that he would destroy Prague if they didn't comply. No one in the West did anything. On April 1, 1939, the Spanish Civil War ended after 3 years with a victory for Francisco Franco's authoritarian nationalists over the democratic Second Spanish Republic. Franco then executed or imprisoned thousands of Republicans, brutally crushing all opposition. He had been helped by the dictators of Italy and Germany, Mussolini and Hitler, but none of the Western democracies came to the aid of the Republic as it succumbed to tyranny. Franco went on to rule Spain as a dictator until his death in 1975. On April 7th to 12th, Italy invaded Albania and then annexed it. Mussolini wanted to prove Italy's military strength to Hitler and to redress the humiliation of World War I when Italy lost portions of Albania. In the U.S., the great black contralto singer Marion Anderson performed for more than 75,000 people at the Lincoln Memorial and millions more via NBC Radio on a cold Easter Sunday on April 9, 1939, after she was denied the use of Constitution Hall for her concert by the racist Daughters of the American Revolution. Her first song was America. She had been the first black person to perform at the White House in 1936, invited by President Roosevelt and the First Lady. They also asked her to sing at the White House for the state visit of King George VI and his wife, Queen Elizabeth of England, in June 1939. She received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Johnson in 1963 after Kennedy had nominated her for it before he was assassinated. Marion Anderson died at age 96. On May 9, 1939, Franco, now a repressive, brutal dictator, removed Spain from the League of Nations. On June 27, 1939, after its second out-of-bounds subperiod, Pluto went in bounds for the second time for 6.5 months. A couple months later, Hitler signed a treaty with Stalin on August 23, 1939, called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after their foreign ministers. Basically, Stalin promised not to help England or France if Germany went to war with Poland. Hitler didn't want to fight on two fronts, so though he hated the Bolsheviks, he was trying to conserve his forces. Stalin went along with the pact since he wanted a piece of Poland for himself. About a month later, still in this second in-bounds Pluto subperiod, on September 1, 1939, World War II began at 4:43 a.m. when a German battleship began firing on a small military depot at Westerplatte in Poland. Hitler's army then invaded Poland with quick and overwhelming military force in what was called the Blitzkrieg, a tactic they used again and again in battles all over Europe. The operation lasted just over a month, ending on October 5, 1939. While Hitler attacked Poland from the west, Stalin's Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, beginning on September 17, 1939. So both Hitler and Stalin occupied the country and divided it between themselves. On September 3, 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany, and the Battle of the Atlantic began, known as the longest continual military campaign in history, ending finally on May 8, 1945, with the defeat of Nazi Germany. It was basically German U-boats and ships battling the Allies, with both sides looking to disrupt the other side's supply lines and troop movements. We didn't find out until long after the war had ended that the Allies were aided in their victories at sea by cracking the Germans' encrypted Enigma code. The Allied dispatches of German Enigma messages were referenced by the code name Ultra, as in ultra secret, a British intelligence designation higher than the highest at the time, which was most secret. Canada declared war on Germany on September 10, 1939. And then on September 27, 1939, Hitler's army opened fire on villages in France, marking the first military operation of World War II in Western Europe. The Nazis were positioned along the Siegfried Line, called the West Wall in Germany, a defensive line of tank traps, bunkers, and tunnels the Nazis built in the late 1930s, stretching almost 400 miles along Germany's western border, opposite the French Maginot Line. The Maginot Line, named after the French Minister of War, André Maginot, was a line of concrete fortifications built by France in the 1930s, with retractable turrets, underground railways, and modern conveniences in the garrisons. It was meant to repel a German attack and give the French army time to mobilize, while forcing Germany to go around the line into Switzerland or Belgium in order to enter France. On November 30th, 1939, 3 months after World War II began, the Soviets invaded parts of Finland in what would be called the Winter War. It lasted 3.5 months and ended with the Moscow Peace Treaty, signed on March 13, 1940, with the Finns ceding 9% of their territory to the USSR. The League of Nations expelled the Soviet Union on December 14, 1939, because of this widely condemned attack against a sovereign nation. The severe losses suffered by the Red Army convinced Hitler that the Soviet Union was vulnerable, which was one of the reasons he went forward with Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia in 1941. Pluto went out of bounds again in Subperiod 3 on January 12, 1940, for 6 months, ending July 12, 1940. On April 9, 1940, the Germans invaded Norway and set up a puppet government ruled by Vidkun Quisling, a former fascist minister of the defense who sold out his country and collaborated with the Nazis, sending Jews to their death in concentration camps in occupied Poland. After the war, Quisling was executed by firing squad for treason, among other crimes, and his name Quisling has become synonymous with traitor. The Nazis simultaneously invaded Denmark on April 9th, and that country surrendered 6 hours later. These two nations had declared themselves neutral when the war first broke out, but now were under Nazi rule. The next month, Hitler invaded France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands on May 10, 1940, in Operation Yellow, the same day Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of Great Britain for the first time. The Battle of Dunkirk from May 26 to June 4, 1940, though lost by the Allies, was spun as a sort of victory for the successful mass evacuation Britain managed to pull off against all odds. The massive German armies greatly outnumbered the French and British troops in France and were steamrolling their way to the Channel to take over all the ports. The Nazis had the French penned in along a corridor to the sea, while Great Britain had troops about 40 miles from Dunkirk. The Nazis had armies on either side of the Allied troops caught in a pocket and could easily have wiped them out, but for an inexplicable order the Nazis were given to halt their movement for 3 days. This gave the Allies enough time to organize an evacuation, which they managed to do, rescuing more than 338,000 troops in 11 days, with the help of a flotilla of British civilian boats of all kinds that ferried soldiers across the Channel under extremely dangerous conditions, with the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, bombing them the whole time. Then on June 10th, Mussolini's fascist Italy joined with Germany and declared war on France and Great Britain. On June 15, 1940, the Soviet Union annexed the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which they controlled for the next 51 years, except for when Hitler annexed them for 3 years for Germany, from July 1941, just before he invaded the USSR, to 1944, when the Soviets recaptured and reclaimed the countries for themselves. On June 22, 1940, France signed an armistice agreement with Nazi Germany, effective on June 25th, surrendering the country to the Nazis. The Germans occupied 60% of France in the north and west, leaving the southeastern area supposedly independent. The new French regime that set up in this unoccupied zone was led by French collaborators under the 84-year-old World War I veteran French Field Marshal Philippe Pétain, and was known as Vichy France, after the town Vichy in central France where the Nazi puppet government was established. Pétain ruled as an authoritarian and anti-Semite and helped the Nazis round up and deport Jews. After the war, he was convicted of treason and sentenced to life imprisonment. Pluto went back in bounds for the third time on July 13, 1940, for 5.5 months. This is when the Battle of Britain occurred, from July 10th to October 31st, 1940, when the Nazis hammered England and its ports and airfields from the air. They transitioned to bombing major cities at night, especially London, from September 7th all the way to May 11th, 1941, a period known as the Blitz. But Great Britain's Royal Air Force fought back valiantly and refused to capitulate. The Brits' use of advanced radar and improvements in aircraft design and their ability to make quick repairs helped them fight off the Nazis. When the Battle of Britain was over, Churchill famously said in a speech honoring the British pilots, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Hitler's plan was to weaken England, especially their air force, to achieve German air supremacy so he could then invade the island from the sea in Operation Sea Lion. But because the British Air Force ultimately prevailed against the German Luftwaffe, Hitler turned his attention to Russia. Pluto went back out of bounds for its fourth subperiod on December 30th, 1940, for 7 months, until July 25th, 1941. On June 22nd, 1941, at 3 a.m., Hitler's Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, something Hitler had promised Stalin he wouldn't do back when they signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939. 6 hours later, Germany declared war on the USSR. Operation Barbarossa was the largest military offensive in history and was supposed to last just 6 weeks, after which Hitler thought he would control all the Soviet Union's resources and stamp out communism. But they fought for 4 more years, till Stalin's army finally successfully defeated the Nazis in 1945, after harsh winters and relentless, fierce fighting. Pluto went back in bounds after this fourth out-of-bounds subperiod on July 26, 1941, for 5 months. During this time, the Blitz ended in London and the Battle of Moscow began on September 30th, 1941, and ended in January 1942 with a Soviet victory led by General Georgy Zhukov, who commanded the defense of the city. In Moscow, General Zhukov pushed the Nazis back through successful counterattacks and organized the inhabitants of the city to turn Moscow into a fortress, barricading streets, digging anti-tank ditches, and defending every block. This was Germany's first major land defeat of World War II. Zhukov was promoted to the rank of Marshal and is widely considered one of the best generals of World War II. He died in Moscow in 1974 at the age of 77. Meanwhile, in the U.S., on December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, damaging and sinking much of the fleet there and killing 2,400 people and injuring more than 1,000 others. The U.S. joined the war the next day, on December 8th, on the side of Great Britain, who also declared war against Japan. Germany and Italy then declared war on the U.S. on December 11, 1941, prompting the U.S. to declare war against those nations, too. President Roosevelt told the American people about the attack on Pearl Harbor via a radio broadcast when he famously said that December 7th was a day which will live in infamy. It was the deadliest attack on U.S. soil until 9/11 in 2001. Pluto was back out of bounds for his fifth subperiod from December 22, 1941 to August 4, 1942, so for 7.5 months. At the Wannsee Conference in Germany on January 20, 1942, convened and chaired by Reinhard Heydrich, Hitler's head of security, Hitler and other top Nazi henchmen discussed exactly how to implement what they called the final solution, the systematic genocide of Jews. They discussed how to streamline mass shootings and death camps where Jews would be gassed in mass murders. Up to this point, Hitler and the Nazis had boycotted Jewish businesses, harassed and beaten up Jews, and passed discriminatory laws, trying to get them to self-deport out of Germany. They also rounded up Jews in ghettos and work camps, isolating and abusing those who refused to leave. But after they invaded Poland with its 2 million Jews, the Jewish question, what to do with all the unwanted Jews in German-occupied territory, was a big problem. The mass murders of Jews supposedly started when Germany invaded Russia in June 1941. That's when the Nazis escalated to using gas vans, where they'd round up Jews, stuff them into vans, and kill them with carbon monoxide, or just kill them in mass shootings. But those methods were deemed inefficient. They needed to figure out how to scale up for genocide. Operation Reinhardt, the mass gassing of Jews, named after Heydrich, went into effect in Poland to murder the 2 million Jews there. Jews were herded to Polish extermination camps in cattle cars by rail. 3 camps in Poland killed around 1.7 million Jews at Treblinka, Belzec, and Sobibor from 1942 to 1943. 3 more camps were added, including one at Auschwitz, the deadliest of all of them, where about 1 million Jews from several countries were gassed with a cyanide-based pesticide called Zyklon B that killed people within minutes. This 4-year period when Nazis systematically slaughtered 6 million Jews in their final solution is known as the Holocaust, since the bodies of the dead Jews were burned in crematories or in open fires. Across the Atlantic, in the U.S., President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942, which stated that to curtail sabotage against national security materials and to prevent espionage, he was authorizing the Secretary of War and the military to forcibly relocate and incarcerate any civilian they deemed a threat. This order came 2 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, which had greatly inflamed national suspicion and racism against Japanese Americans, much like the attacks on 9/11 gave rise to violent anti-Muslim sentiment in the years after 2001. The military ended up forcing the immediate evacuation and incarceration of about 122,000 men, women, and children of Japanese descent to what were called internment camps in remote areas across 6 western states. The camps were surrounded by barbed wire and patrolled by armed guards who had orders to shoot anyone who tried to escape. Though the camps were generally humane, most lacked decent medical care. The families lost everything. They were forced to quickly sell what they could, but many just had to abandon their homes, cars, businesses, and jobs, and all their possessions, taking with them only what they could carry. Around 110,000 were American citizens, the rest resident aliens. They appealed their case all the way to the Supreme Court, but in 1944, the court upheld the legality of their incarceration. They were finally released 3 years later, with the last of the camps at Tule Lake, California, shutting down in March 1946. It wasn't until 1988, when Congress passed the Civil Liberties Act, that the government acknowledged and apologized for the injustice of their actions and paid $20,000 restitution to each person who was locked up and deprived of their liberty and property. On the other side of the world, in May 1942, from the 4th to the 8th, the US and Australia fought Japan in the Battle of the Coral Sea, which the Allies won, preventing the Japanese from establishing air bases in southeastern New Guinea. It was a notable battle for being fought entirely between aircraft carriers, fought with airplanes instead of surface ships shooting at each other. A month later, the Allies won another decisive victory in the Battle of Midway, from June 4th to 7th in 1942. It was a turning point in the war's Pacific theater, as the Allies greatly weakened the Imperial Japanese Navy and dashed their hopes of establishing a base on the island of Midway that would allow the Japanese to control the region and attack Pearl Harbor again. After Midway, the Japanese Empire began to shrink as the Allies won more and more territory through invasions and sea battles. Over in Europe, Reinhard Heydrich, the one who had chaired the meeting to discuss the mass extermination of Jews, died on June 4, 1942, of sepsis from wounds he suffered 8 days earlier on May 27th from an assassination attempt by the Czech resistance in Operation Anthropoid. His assassination led to severe and brutal reprisals by the Nazis, including the total destruction and massacre of 340 people, men, women, and children. The women and children not shot in the village were sent to concentration camps, though 9 children passed racial muster as sufficiently Aryan-looking, so were raised by Nazi German families. The next month, July 17, 1942, still in this 5th subperiod of Pluto's out-of-bounds north cycle, the Nazis and their Axis allies, as part of Hitler's Operation Barbarossa, invaded the major industrial city of Stalingrad in southern Russia. The fighting lasted until February 2, 1943, so over the harsh and freezing cold winter, when Germany suffered from non-stop attacks on their supply lines. It was the single largest and most expensive battle in history, just brutal, horrific urban warfare, with millions dead, many of them civilians. The Soviet Union prevailed in holding the city thanks to their counteroffensive plan called Operation Uranus, led by General Zhukov, which began November 19, 1942, and involved targeting the weak flanks of Hitler's army. The Soviets finally forced the Germans to surrender, against Hitler's orders, after completely surrounding the German Sixth Army. The Battle of Stalingrad was considered another turning point in the war, as it greatly weakened Hitler's forces and stopped them from invading further into Russia. Pluto went back in bounds after this 5th out-of-bounds subperiod for 4.5 months on August 5, 1942, till mid-December. During this time, the UK General Bernard Montgomery, known as Monty, fought the outnumbered Nazi General Erwin Rommel's army in the Second Battle of El Alamein in North Africa, beginning October 23, 1942, in the Western Desert Campaign. The fighting was fierce, but around 12 days later, on November 4, 1942, the Allies won, taking over 30,000 German prisoners of war and sending Rommel scurrying all the way back to Tunisia, prompting UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill to quip, "It may almost be said, before El Alamein, we never had a victory. After El Alamein, we never had a defeat." The Germans got hammered by the Allies in the Battle of Tunisia, too, a series of battles beginning on November 17, 1942, and ending in an Allied victory about 6 months later, when Pluto was once again out of bounds in his 6th subperiod. German and Italian forces had withdrawn here after being defeated in the Western Desert Campaign and in Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. Over 260,000 Axis troops were taken prisoner after the Battle of Tunisia. Pluto's sixth out-of-bounds subperiod began on December 17, 1942, and lasted for 7.5 months till August 9, 1943. During this time, the Battle of Stalingrad ended on February 2, 1943, and the Battle of Tunisia ended on May 13, 1943. With these major victories, the Allies had succeeded in greatly weakening the German army on the Eastern Front and in Africa. In Europe, the Allies scored another big win with the invasion of Sicily, called Operation Husky, a battle that raged from July 9th to August 17th, 1943, with over 3,000 Allied ships carrying 150,000 ground troops, protected by over 4,000 Allied airplanes, all of that against just 2 German divisions. They'd fooled the Germans into thinking they were going to invade the islands of Corsica and Sardinia, so the Nazis had mobilized troops there, leaving Sicily vulnerable to an Allied attack. This victory, led by Britain's General Montgomery, enabled the Allies to get a toehold in Italy and end the fascist dictatorship of Mussolini. In fact, Italian partisans formed a new government and captured Mussolini and arrested him, with King Victor Emmanuel III's blessing on July 25, 1943, ending El Duce's almost 21 years of fascist rule. But there were still a lot of Nazi troops fighting in Italy. Pluto went back in bounds for the next 4 months after this sixth subperiod, starting August 10, 1943, so for the last week of the Battle of Sicily. In September, from the 3rd to the 17th, 1943, the Allies successfully invaded Italy, landing at Salerno on the west coast of the mainland, and proceeded to drive out Germany, basically removing Italy from the war. During this battle, the Nazis successfully rescued Mussolini in Operation Oak on September 12, 1943, from where the fascist dictator had been imprisoned in a hotel high up on the mountain in central Italy. The raid had been personally ordered by Hitler and carried out by Nazi commandos, who documented the whole thing with cameras for maximum propaganda appeal. Mussolini, weak and seriously ill, was taken to Munich to meet with Hitler 2 days later, on September 14th. He recovered once he had his freedom and was ordered by Hitler to northern Italy to reign there over the newly formed Italian Social Republic, a puppet state of Germany, where Mussolini lived for the next 2 years. Toward the end of Pluto's sixth in-bounds subperiod, the big 3 Allied leaders, Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill, and Franklin Roosevelt, met for the first time at a conference at the Soviet embassy in Tehran, Iran, codenamed Operation Eureka, from November 28th to December 1st, 1943, to discuss overall strategy for how to win World War II. They discussed opening a second front against the Nazis in Western Europe by June 1944 to pull the Nazis away from battling Russia on the Eastern Front. Pluto's seventh out-of-bounds subperiod began on December 15, 1943, and ran for 8 months till August 10, 1944. It was in this period, right before the middle of the entire Pluto out-of-bound north cycle of 16 subperiods, that D-Day occurred on June 6, 1944, known as Operation Neptune, the amphibious landing phase of the overall Allied invasion of Europe called Operation Overlord. D-Day involved 39 Allied divisions crossing the English Channel and landing their armies on the beaches of Normandy, opening a Western front in World War II. Operation Neptune was the largest seaborne invasion in history. General Eisenhower was the supreme commander of Operation Overlord, and General Montgomery was in charge of all the land forces. The Allies had meticulously planned for it for over a year, developing an elaborate deception at the same time called Operation Bodyguard to fool the Germans into thinking that they were going to land at a later date in several different locations. So Hitler had troops spread all over the western coast of Europe. Meanwhile, the Allies were trying to hide the massive buildup of troops that would cross the Channel for Normandy in June. There were 1.5 million American troops in the UK by May 1945. The weather delayed the operation for 24 hours, and then General Eisenhower gave the go-ahead right after midnight on June 6th, first landing 24,000 American, Canadian, and British airborne troops, then launching around 132,000 soldiers in the amphibious invasion around 6:30 a.m. on Normandy beaches, divided into 5 areas, called Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, though a strong storm blew the armies destined for Utah and Omaha beaches off course. The worst of the fighting was at Omaha Beach, where American troops met heavy German resistance and suffered more casualties there than all the other beaches combined. The Allies managed to establish beachheads that first day on all 5 locations, but it took them until June 12th to link the bridgeheads together, and until July 21st to capture the town of Ka, a little over 9 miles inland from the coast. Once on the continent, the Allied forces had to contend with the Nazi armies occupying most of Europe, and with logistical nightmares involving delays in equipment and provisions due to gridlock because of mud and minesweeping and other obstacles, but they managed to spread steadily west, liberating town after town. And then Pluto went back in bounds after the 7th subperiod for 4 months on August 11, 1944. Days later, the Allied Operation Dragoon began on August 15, 1944, to secure French ports on the Mediterranean coast and pressure the Germans to fight on yet another front. Dragoon was supposed to occur simultaneously with Operation Neptune on D-Day, but there was a lot of controversy among the Allied nations about its significance, and it ended up getting delayed so the Allies could focus resources on the Normandy invasion. But the ports were soon hopelessly clogged in Normandy, so the Allies proceeded with Dragoon to help with their logistical needs. In late August, aided by the uprisings of the French resistance, the Allies quickly defeated the Germans, who were spread too thin in southern France, and retreated north. Paris was liberated on August 25, 1944, with German forces surrendering to the undefeated General Philippe Leclerc of the French 2nd Armored Division. Leclerc would die tragically in a plane crash in French Algeria just 2 years later. General Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French Forces and future French Prime Minister and then President of the Fifth Republic, led the Liberation Day Parade on August 26, 1944, down the Champs-Élysées. Pluto was back out of bounds on December 14, 1944, for its 8th subperiod that lasted 8 months until August 10, 1945. 2 days into this out-of-bounds subperiod, on December 16, 1944, the Germans launched a major offensive in the Ardennes region of Belgium, leading to what would be called the Battle of the Bulge that would rage for about 41 days. The Ardennes was a densely forested, hilly area with steep river valleys and few good roads where it was believed troops would probably not want to fight because of the rough terrain. So it's where battle-weary U.S. troops were resting and fresh U.S. recruits were assembling, 4 divisions of American soldiers in all. The weather that December was terrible, bitterly cold and snowy with thick fog, which prevented the usual air reconnaissance units from monitoring the area. So when hundreds of German paratroopers landed and Nazi troops came crashing through the forest before dawn with tanks and artillery in their blitzkrieg attack, the Americans were totally surprised and outnumbered, something like 5-1 and even 10-1 in some places. Hitler's battle plan, called Operation Watch on the Rhine, was to attack in 3 main areas along this 75-mile stretch of eastern Belgium and northern Luxembourg, in the north, the center, and the south, taking control of the roads leading to the critical Allied port of Antwerp, thereby cutting off Allied supplies and dividing the British and American armies, encircling them, and forcing them to surrender. Hitler could then focus his remaining military strength on fighting the Russians. The plan depended on swift action, overwhelming strength, and surprise, so the Allies couldn't mobilize and reinforce troops and supplies in time to stop German advance. The weather was in the Germans' favor since the forecast was 3 days of heavy cloud cover, preventing Allied air attacks. Hitler thought it would take just 4 days for the Germans to push their way through the Ardennes and seize the port at Antwerp. The Americans were quickly overwhelmed in the north area, and many surrendered after fighting bravely against the stronger German forces. Around 100 or so American soldiers were herded to a field south of the town of Malmedy on December 17th, and then shot at close range by SS troopers, with at least 84 American soldiers executed in cold blood, and the rest fleeing into the forest. It became known as the Malmedy Massacre, considered one of the most brutal war crimes against troops in World War II. News quickly spread of this atrocity, inspiring American soldiers to avenge their murdered comrades and fight even harder against the Nazis, which they did in the Battle of Elsenborn Ridge in a steep northern rocky section of the Ardennes. New recruits from the 99th Infantry Division fiercely defended this ridge against the superior armored equipment of the German 6th Panzer Army, successfully pounding the Germans below and jamming up the roads, penning the German tanks and troops into narrow corridors where they were bottlenecked, wreaking havoc on the Nazis' tight battle schedule. Though the Germans were able to eventually capture the towns below, the Americans defended the ridge for 11 days, successfully holding off the German advance and forcing them to reroute. In the center, the battle was in St. Vith, a hub town where several roads converged that the Germans needed to capture for strategic purposes on their push to the sea. The outnumbered American troops, low on food, medicine, and ammunition, fought valiantly in close quarters, sabotaging and counterattacking the Germans, who laid siege to the town. The Americans managed to hold off the Germans, delaying their advance until General Montgomery ordered the Americans to retreat, surrendering the town to the Nazis. The Germans gained ground here in the center region and raced west, but were hampered by lack of fuel. They were finally stopped by Allied forces late on Christmas Eve, when the weather cleared and the Air Force could provide some cover. In the south, the Americans also thwarted the Germans and held them long enough through brutal combat to severely delay their timetable. The Germans lay siege to Bastogne by December 21st, but the Americans, with barely any food, ammunition, or medical supplies, held the town, denying the Nazis access to the crucial paved roads leading through the mountainous area. When the Germans gave the surrounded Americans a chance to surrender, the American 101st Airborne Division General Anthony McAuliffe replied, "Nuts." His men held on, thanks to some Allied airdrop supplies over the next few days, until General Patton's Third Army, fighting in northeastern France at the time, was ordered to head north and counterattack. Patton's army raced through the snow and the ice and the mud in 2 days and broke the siege of Bastogne on December 26th, but it took another month before the Allies could push the Germans back to where they were before the Nazi offensive began. The Battle of the Bulge was the costliest battle for Americans in the war, with 75,000 to 83,000 casualties, though the Germans suffered 120,000 casualties, along with losing over 1,000 tanks and another 1,000 aircraft, in addition to more than 2,000 artillery pieces they couldn't replace, all of which severely weakened their forces and left them vulnerable to future attacks. It was Hitler's last major offensive. After this, the Germans' only move was to retreat. A month or so after the Battle of the Bulge, still in Pluto's 8th out of bounds subperiod, in either February or March 1945, Anne Frank died at the Nazi Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. She was just 15 years old. She's the Jewish-Dutch teenager famous for the poignant diary she kept while in hiding in Amsterdam before the Nazis found her family and shipped them off to die with about 70,000 other people who perished at Bergen-Belsen before the Allies liberated it a couple months later on April 15, 1945. From February 4th to the 11th, 1945, the Big Three, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, met for a second time at a conference in Yalta, in the Crimea, to discuss how to reorganize Germany and Europe and establish the United Nations once the war was over. The Allies had by then liberated Belgium and France, and it was clear they were going to win the war. FDR also wanted Stalin to pledge to help defeat Japan once the Nazis were defeated. They also all agreed to prosecute war criminals. On March 22, 1945, the Allied invasion of Germany began, called the Central Europe Campaign, when the Western Allies crossed the Rhine River from the west and spread out all over Germany. This marked the final stage of World War II in Europe. General Patton's Third Army had crossed the Rhine into the German town of Oppenheim, following the next day by General Montgomery's 21st Army at Ries and just south of Wesel, Germany, in Operation Plunder. The Soviets, meanwhile, were heading into Vienna, and by late April, they were storming Berlin. In the Pacific Theater, the Allies won the Battle of Okinawa, known as Operation Iceberg, which was fought from April 1st to June 22, 1945. This was the largest amphibious military assault in the Pacific Theater of the war. It was also one of the bloodiest, with 12.5 thousand American soldiers, sailors, and Marines killed and 100 to 120,000 Japanese soldiers killed, along with countless civilian casualties. It was the final battle of the war. Over 300 Japanese kamikaze pilots sacrificed themselves to trying to stop the armada of Allied ships from getting to the island. In total, the Japanese flew over 2,000 suicide missions by the time the war was over. And then, on April 12, 1945, Franklin Roosevelt, the 32nd President of the United States, in his 4th term of office, died from a cerebral stroke in Warm Springs, Georgia, as he was sitting for a portrait. He complained of a severe headache, then collapsed, lost consciousness, and was pronounced dead shortly after. He was 63 years old. In addition to the polio that paralyzed him at age 39 back in 1921, he had lately been suffering from heart trouble and high blood pressure. His vice president, Harry Truman, was sworn in that same day as the 33rd president. Truman had a lot of catching up to do, as he hadn't been included in most war plans and knew nothing about the top-secret Manhattan Project, the American operation to develop a nuclear bomb. Just 4 days after FDR died, the Battle of Berlin began on April 16, 1945. It ended on May 2, 1945, with the Allies crushing Nazi Germany. In Italy, Mussolini was executed by Italian partisans on April 28, 1945, at age 61. He and his mistress had been captured as they tried to flee their lodgings on Lake Como. Mussolini's body was dumped in Milan's Piazzale Loreto, where it was mutilated, kicked, spat on, and hung upside down from a girder by an angry mob. 2 days after that, on the last day of the month, April 30th, 1945, the madman most responsible for the unspeakable horrors of World War II, Adolf Hitler, committed suicide in his underground bunker in Berlin when he shot himself in the head. He was 56. Eva Braun, his longtime mistress he married the previous day, also committed suicide, taking cyanide poisoning. She was 33 years old. Hitler had been so horrified by what had happened to Mussolini's corpse that he left instructions for his cronies to get all the petrol they could find and burn his and Eva's bodies in the garden outside the Reich Chancellery, where his bunker was located. All that was ever found of their bodies were dental remains. His death was announced on German radio on May 1, 1945. A week later, on May 8, 1945, Germany's unconditional surrender of all their military forces to the Allies was made public. It is now known as VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. The war wasn't over everywhere, though, since the Pacific Theater hostilities were still ongoing against the Japanese. On June 26, 1945, the United Nations came into being, with the signing of the UN Charter by 51 nations whose mission was to promote peace and discussing and resolving global problems in cooperative ways that benefited all humanity. The Big Three Allied leaders met for a third time on August 1, 1945, for the Potsdam Agreement, with President Harry Truman now representing the U.S. instead of FDR. Their mission was to formalize how the three Allied nations would divvy up Germany and Europe and discuss how Germany would pay reparations. There was some controversy about why they didn't invite General de Gaulle, the leader of France, to this third and final conference. It seems the Big Three leaders feared de Gaulle would want to renegotiate the terms they'd agreed upon at Yalta, and none of them wanted to go through all that again. Plus, de Gaulle was haughty and difficult to get along with, so they decided it was best to just leave him out of the conference. 5 days later, on August 6, 1945, the U.S. dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan, followed by a second nuclear bomb in Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. I analyzed the chart of the Hiroshima bombing in my short here, if you're interested. The bombings resulted in widespread devastation and up to 246,000 dead, mostly civilians, which included thousands who died immediately from the bombings, 70,000 in Hiroshima and 40,000 in Nagasaki, and more who died later from injuries and radiation-related illnesses. Then Pluto went back in bounds on August 11, 1945 for the 8th time. Emperor Hirohito gave his radio broadcast surrendering to the Allies on August 15, 1945. This is now known as VJ Day, Victory in Japan Day, when Japanese leaders signed the Instruments of Surrender document. With Pluto still in bounds, the Nuremberg Trials began on November 20, 1945, with the International Military Tribunal prosecuting and sentencing 24 Nazis for their crimes against humanity and their war crimes. Overall, 10 were executed. Those are the names listed in red in this table. 3 committed suicide. Those are the names in blue. 2 were sentenced to life imprisonment. 4 got between 10 to 20 years. And 1 was sentenced to death in absentia. That's Martin Bormann, the purple name at the top. He was the Nazi Party's secretary and fled before he could be captured at the end of the war. Remains discovered in Berlin in 1972 were later confirmed to be his, but it's not known if he was killed or committed suicide. 1 Nazi was considered too senile to stand trial, and 3 were acquitted of all charges. Those are the names highlighted in yellow. Of the 3 suicides, Hermann Göring, head of the Gestapo and the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, committed suicide right before he was supposed to be executed. Rudolf Hess was the last of these Nazis alive in Spandau prison, serving a life sentence there when he committed suicide at age 93 in 1987. World War II was finally over when Pluto moved into its 9th out-of-bounds subperiod on December 17, 1945, lasting 8 months till August 8, 1946. On January 10, 1946, the United Nations General Assembly met for the first time in person in London. The group chose New York City for their permanent site, though the buildings wouldn't be completed there until October 19, 1952, between the 15th and 16th Pluto out-of-bounds north subperiods. Pluto's highest declination of this entire 15-year out-of-bounds cycle was in this 9th subperiod on April 9, 1946. It reached 24 degrees north 7 minutes, 39 arc minutes. Remember, declination is the same in both tropical and sidereal zodiacs, and for all ionamshas. Please see my astrology coordinates video for details about that if you don't understand. After this highest date of declination, Pluto began its slow decrease in declination. Pluto's out-of-bounds subperiods also began decreasing in duration, lasting fewer days at first and eventually many fewer months. In 1946, in this 9th subperiod, on April 18th, the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, met for its first session at The Hague. This is the judicial branch of the UN, the only international court that deals with disputes among nations. It's the only branch of the UN not located in New York City. On April 29, 1946, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East began, also known as the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. This court, modeled after the Nuremberg Court, tried 28 Japanese military and political leaders for war crimes and crimes against peace and humanity. When the court adjourned on November 12, 1948, 25 defendants had been found guilty. 2 had died of natural causes, and 1 was found unfit to stand trial. Of the 25 guilty defendants, 7 were executed and 16 sentenced to life imprisonment, though 13 were later paroled between 1952 and 1958. The other 3 died of natural causes in prison. On May 9, 1946, in Italy, King Victor Emmanuel III abdicated his throne in favor of his son, Umberto. Victor Emmanuel's reputation had been greatly harmed by his association with Mussolini, but the next month, on June 2nd, Italy voted to abolish its constitutional monarchy in favor of establishing a republic, which they did on June 10, 1946. Umberto saw the writing on the wall and abdicated on June 13, 1946, and went into exile in Portugal, while his father, Victor Emmanuel III, went to Egypt, where he died in 1947. Pluto went back in bounds for the 9th time for 3.5 months on August 9, 1946, during which time the Nuremberg Trials ended on October 1, 1946. A couple weeks later, on October 16, 1946, 10 of the 11 Nazis sentenced to death were executed by hanging. Hermann Göring, remember, had killed himself the day before. Pluto's 10th out-of-bounds subperiod began on December 23, 1946, and ended on August 3, 1947, lasting 7.5 months. The Paris Peace Conference took place on February 10, 1947. Peace treaties were signed by 9 countries: the UK, the USSR, the USA, the government of France that was in a pact with Germany and Italy, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Finland. The treaties went into effect later that year on September 15, 1947. On March 12, 1947, the U.S. pledged to support democracies with the Truman Doctrine by helping the democracies resist Soviet invasion and authoritarian threats. This is also the beginning of the Cold War, the covert political and economic rivalry between the world's 2 superpowers, the USSR and the USA. On the home front, President Truman issued Executive Order No. 9835 on March 21, 1947, requiring all federal civil servants be screened for loyalty, not to him like Trump's loyalty tests, but to the Constitution and democracy. Truman wanted to root out all federal government employees with fascist or totalitarian sympathies. He was in effect looking for spies. More than 2,700 people were fired and another 12,000 resigned between 1947 and 1956 during the years of the Second Red Scare. Pluto went back in bounds on August 4, 1947 for 5 months. On August 15, 1947, the Indian Independence Act took effect. This was a law passed by the British Parliament the month before, creating 2 independent dominions, India and Pakistan, which until then had been under British colonial rule. This act was in effect for 3 years, from 1947 to 1950, since the former British India, now the Dominion of India and Dominion of Pakistan, still belonged to the Commonwealth, but Britain was no longer running things politically. These first few years of independence were very violent, marked by religious anarchy and fighting, mostly between Hindus and Muslims. Pluto's 11th out-of-bounds subperiod began on December 30, 1947, and ended 7 months later on July 27, 1948. Italy's new constitution went into effect on January 1, 1948. A month into the subperiod, on January 30, 1948, the Indian Hindu lawyer and a leader of Indian nationalism, Mohandas Gandhi, was assassinated in his country at age 78. He was also called Mahatma Gandhi, which was a Sanskrit title bestowed on him in 1914 when he lived in South Africa. That means great-souled. He rose to prominence in India through the struggle for India's independence from British rule, with his movement of nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience in the 1920s. After India had gained independence from Britain in 1947 and violence broke out between Hindus and Muslims, Gandhi tried to alleviate it. But a Hindu extremist, who was angry at Gandhi for defending Muslims, shot him in the chest 3 times at a prayer meeting, killing him. His assassination resulted in global shock and mourning. Today, Gandhi's birthday, October 2nd, is celebrated as a national holiday in India, and he's considered the father of his country. The next month, from February 21st to 25th, 1948, the Czechoslovakian government was taken over by the Communist Party, supported by Stalin's Soviet Union, in a coup d'etat. Czechoslovakia would be under communist rule for the next 40 years. This was yet another alarming development in the ever-increasing Cold War paranoia of the times, and led to President Truman signing the Marshall Plan on April 3, 1948, which pledged financial aid to 16 European nations in an effort to help them recover economically after the war and keep them from running into the arms of the Soviets. The U.S. gave $13.3 billion to Europe, about $137 billion in today's dollars, to help get their economies going again. The plan was named after its author, George C. Marshall, who was Truman's Secretary of State. He had also been a high-ranking general in World War II. For his commitment to Europe's post-war recovery via the Marshall Plan, he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1953. On May 14, 1948, the State of Israel was created through the Israeli Declaration of Independence, proclaimed by David Ben-Gurion, the country's first prime minister. Of course, this led to never-ending violence and conflicts with the Palestinians who lived there and who were displaced by the thousands, losing their lands and homes. The region has been a hotbed of violence ever since. Pluto then went inbounds for the 11th time for about 7 months, starting on July 28, 1948. On October 12, 1948, the International Tribunal on Japanese War Crimes adjourned. Almost 2.5 months later, on December 23, 1948, the 7 Japanese men sentenced to death in the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal were executed by hanging. Pluto's 12th out-of-bounds subperiod began on January 7, 1949, and finished about 6.5 months later on July 19, 1949. On January 20th, 1949, Harry S. Truman was inaugurated as the President of the United States. He'd been the 33rd president since FDR died in 1945, but in the 1948 election, he surprised everyone by beating out his rival, Republican Thomas E. Dewey, who was widely expected to win. Truman continued FDR's New Deal reforms, though he had to contend with a conservative Republican Congress who refused to pass civil rights legislation, prohibiting discrimination in government and desegregating the armed forces. So Truman was forced to do those things with executive orders. On April 4, 1949, NATO was created, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance of 12 nation-states, 2 in North America, the US and Canada, and 10 in Europe. There are now 32 nations in NATO. The treaty includes Article 5, which says that all the countries will come to another's aid militarily in case one of them is invaded by a hostile nation. The only time Article 5 has ever been invoked since 1949 was after 9/11 in 2001, when al-Qaeda terrorists attacked the World Trade Center in the Pentagon, and NATO allies came to the defense of the United States when they deployed troops to Afghanistan. A couple weeks after NATO was formed, the Republic of Ireland left the British Commonwealth on April 18, 1949. Northern Ireland remained in the UK. The Republic of Ireland joined the UN in 1955 and the European Communities in 1973, a precursor to the European Union today. But Ireland has never joined NATO and remains a neutral country militarily. The next month, on May 23, 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany, FRG, or West Germany, was established. Its capital was in Bonn, and it was comprised of 12 states that were formed in the Allied zones occupied by the US, France, and the UK after World War II. Later, in 1961, the Berlin Wall was constructed by East Germany to separate East from West Berlin, so East German citizens wouldn't flee to the West. Pluto went inbounds for the 12th time on July 20th, 1949, for about 7 months. 5 weeks into the subperiod, on August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, the RDS-1, called First Lightning, which cranked up the fear and paranoia of the Cold War even more. The bombs the US dropped on Japan, called Little Boy on Hiroshima and Fat Man on Nagasaki, were 15 kilotons and 20 kilotons, respectively. A kiloton is the explosive energy equivalent to 1,000 tons of TNT. This Russian bomb was 22 kilotons and was based on the American design of Fat Man. On October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong, the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, proclaimed the People's Republic of China in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. He presented China's new flag and presided over the first military parade of the People's Liberation Army. The people loyal to the Republic of China, the ROC, having lost the Civil War and mainland China to the CCP, all fled to the island of Taiwan by December 1949. About a week later, on October 7, 1949, the German Democratic Republic, GDR, or East Germany, was formed in the Soviet-occupied zone of Germany. Though it has the word democratic in its name, it was a repressive communist state, it described as an authoritarian satellite nation of the Soviet Union. Pluto's 13th out-of-bounds subperiod lasted 6 months, from January 18, 1950 to July 9, 1950. On January 26, 1950, India's constitution went into effect, transforming the Dominion of India into the Republic of India. The constitution was adopted on November 26 the year before and is the longest written constitution in the world. January 26th is celebrated in India as Republic Day. On February 9, 1950, Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin delivered a speech on Lincoln Day to the Republican Women's Club of Wheeling, West Virginia, and brandished a piece of paper saying it was a list of known communists working for the State Department. He claimed it had 205 names on it, and that the list had been given to the Secretary of State, but nothing had been done about it. The story blew up in the media and garnered a ton of publicity for McCarthy, which he milked to the hilt. McCarthy's obsession with hunting down communists became known as the Second Red Scare in U.S. history. The first one lasted from 1917 to 1920, right after the Russian Revolution, with the rise of labor unions and leftist ideologies. J. Edgar Hoover, working for the Department of Justice, accused practically everyone on the left of being a communist spy. After World War II, Hoover was more paranoid than ever about communist infiltration, especially in the government. The fear was that spies would give the Soviet Union our nuclear secrets, making us vulnerable to enemy nuclear attacks. And there were Soviet spy rings operating in many Western nations, including the U.S. The House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, had formed in 1938 to investigate subversive activities and became a permanent committee in 1945. The committee investigated any threats or propaganda against democracy and subpoenaed numerous witnesses who testified to knowing about spies and communist infiltrators during and after the war. The committee's activities really exploded into widespread paranoia after the founding of Communist China. In 1947, HUAC focused on persecuting Hollywood writers, directors, actors, and lawyers for supposedly spreading propaganda about communism through the movies, or just being sympathetic to communism or labor unions, resulting in many of them being held in contempt and/or blacklisted. Richard Nixon, who was a California Republican representative in Congress on the committee, became well known as one of the commie hunters. He maneuvered his way into the Senate in 1950 by accusing his opponent of being a communist. That's the campaign that earned him the name Tricky Dicky. Once in the Senate, he befriended McCarthy. For the next 4 years, McCarthy accused a wide variety of people, from celebrities and artists to school teachers, people who worked in the media, and government employees, of belonging to or being sympathetic to the Communist Party. Instead of proof, he resorted to malicious innuendo and outright lies. The result was widespread political persecution and paranoia. McCarthyism didn't end until 1954, after Pluto's out-of-bounds north cycle had ended. The McCarthy hearings were by then being televised to about 20 million people, with his latest target being the U.S. Army, until the Army's lawyer, Joseph Welch, after 36 days of hearing testimony, said to McCarthy, "Have you no sense of decency, sir, at long last? Have you left no sense of decency?" That was the end of McCarthy's witch hunts, as most of the nation was behind Welch at that point. Joe McCarthy was censored by the Senate later that year in 1954, but remained a senator until he died of alcoholism in 1957. Today he's considered a disgrace, and his name is synonymous with demagogues and liars who promote excessive government repression. Meanwhile, adding to the fears of communist takeovers, the Korean War began on June 25, 1950, still in this 13th out-of-bounds subperiod, when North Korea invaded South Korea. North Korea was supported by the communist nations of China and the Soviet Union, while the nations that came to South Korea's aid were from the United Nations Command, with most of the forces provided by the U.S. It was called the first proxy war of the Cold War, since it was essentially between the USSR and the USA, though the U.S. never formally declared war. Truman described it as a police action. His administration was afraid of making the mistake of appeasement, which is how the UK's Neville Chamberlain tried to deal with Hitler and fascism, which of course led to the Nazis overrunning all of Europe. So the US chose the strategy of containment, hoping to prevent communist forces from overtaking Asia. On July 3, 1950, the world's first ever combat strike by jet aircraft was launched from the US carrier Valley Forge and bombed a North Korean airfield and railroad yards. Then Pluto went inbounds for the 13th time on July 10, 1950 for 6.5 months. On October 18, 1950, UN forces captured the North Korean capital of Pyongyang for the first time, forcing North Koreans to retreat closer to the Chinese border, which prompted China to enter the war a couple weeks later, on November 1, 1950. Pluto's 14th out-of-bounds subperiod in this out-of-bounds north cycle began on January 31, 1951, and ran for 5 months till June 28, 1951. On February 27, 1951, this 22nd Amendment was ratified by the required 36 of the 48 states in the U.S., limiting a president to 2 terms. The amendment had first been approved by Congress back in 1947 and was then sent to the states for ratification. This, of course, came after Franklin Roosevelt had been the first president to run for more than 2 terms. He was elected to 4 terms, though he died about 4 months after his 4th inauguration in 1945, back in Pluto's 8th out-of-bounds subperiod. Up until his presidency, all U.S. presidents had adhered to the tradition set by George Washington of running for just 2 terms max. On April 11, 1951, President Truman relieved General MacArthur of his command in the Korean War for insubordination. MacArthur wanted to expand the war into China and use nuclear weapons there. He made his thoughts known publicly, challenging the president. It was seen as a controversial battle for civilian control of the military, and Truman won. The U.S. did not expand the war into China and did not deploy nuclear weapons. On May 25 and 26, 1951, British diplomats turned Russian spies Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean defected to the USSR, though it wasn't confirmed they were in Moscow until 5 years later, in 1956, when they appeared at a press conference there. They were members of the notorious Cambridge Five, a British spy ring that began in the 1930s in England. Burgess and Maclean's defections did much to damage U.S.-UK intelligence relations during the Cold War. Maclean lived in Washington, D.C. from 1944 to 1948, when he passed American nuclear secrets to the Soviets. He also passed vital information to the Soviets about U.S. plans during the Korean War. Pluto went back inbounds for the 14th time on June 29, 1951. Shortly after, on July 10, 1951, armistice talks began between North and South Korea, although they would drag on for 2 more years. UN troops had recaptured Seoul, South Korea in June as part of a counteroffensive campaign launched against North Korea in May. It was a response to an offensive campaign by the North Koreans that spring. Lots of territory changed hands during these fierce attacks and counterattacks, which led to a sort of stalemate. Across the pond, on October 26, 1951, Winston Churchill was re-elected Prime Minister of the UK when his Conservative Party won the general election by a small margin. He was 76 years old at the time, and the second oldest prime minister in history, after William Gladstone, who was 82 when he began his 4th term in 1892. On February 6, 1952, Princess Elizabeth of the UK was proclaimed Queen Elizabeth II when her father, King George VI, died after a long illness. Elizabeth was in Kenya at the time with her husband, Prince Philip, their first stop on a Commonwealth tour they were making in place of her ailing father. She was the UK's 40th monarch since William the Conqueror in 1066, who became king right at the end of a Pluto out-of-bounds south cycle that began in 1028 and lasted 39 years until 1067. Pluto's 15th out-of-bounds subperiod began on February 15, 1952, and finished 4 months later on June 13, 1952. Greece and Turkey joined NATO on February 18, 1952, the first nations to do so after the 12-member alliance was created in 1949. The Treaty of San Francisco, signed on September 8, 1951, officially went into effect on April 28, 1952, formally ending the war between Japan and the Allied powers. The treaty ended the post-war occupation of Japan by nearly 1 million Allied soldiers and dealt with prisoner exchanges. It was the only time in Japan's history that it had been occupied by a foreign army, though the Allies didn't interfere in the governing of Japan, as Hitler did in all the countries he invaded and occupied. On June 15, 1952, Anne Frank's Diary of a Young Girl was first published in English. The young Jewish Dutch girl and budding writer had perished in a German concentration camp toward the end of World War II at age 15, back in Pluto's 8th out-of-bounds subperiod in 1945. The publication of her diaries chronicled her 2 years in hiding in Amsterdam when the Nazis were terrorizing Europe and hunting Jews. Her diaries were found after the war and given to her father, Otto Frank, who was the only one of the family who survived the concentration camp. He published the Dutch edition in 1947. Her diary has now been published in over 70 languages. Pluto went inbounds on June 14, 1952, for the 15th time for about 9 months. During this time, on November 1, 1952, the U.S. detonated the first hydrogen bomb in the Marshall Islands in a test called Ivy Mike. The H-bomb, which relied on nuclear fusion, produced 10.4 megatons of TNT, or 10,400 kilotons, so it was massively more powerful than the previous atom bombs the US dropped on Japan in 1945. It was determined that the prototype they tested wasn't feasible as a weapon, so they continued developing the idea. On January 20th, 1953, Dwight Eisenhower was inaugurated for the first of his 2 terms as the 34th President of the United States. He had been the Supreme Commander of Allied forces in World War II and of Operation Overlord, the amphibious military invasion of Europe. On February 28, 1953, American biologist James Watson and English physicist Francis Crick announced their discovery of the DNA molecule, deoxyribonucleic acid, 2 polynucleotide chains that coil around each other like a double helix and contain the genetic material or instructions for growth and reproduction of all known organisms. Their paper appeared in Nature on April 25, 1953. They won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1962 for their discoveries. They made their DNA discovery after their friend and biophysicist Maurice Wilkins gave them unpublished X-ray diffraction results called Photo 51 that belonged to his colleague Rosalind Franklin and her grad student Raymond Gosling of King's College London, without first getting Franklin's permission, which stirred up a lot of controversy in later years, tainting the story of DNA's discovery with charges of sexism. Pluto's very last out-of-bounds subperiod, its 16th of this northern cycle, began on March 6, 1953, and ended just 2.5 months later on May 26, 1953. On March 5, 1953, the very day before Pluto went back out of bounds this last time, Joseph Stalin, the murderous, ruthless dictator of the Soviet Union and their second leader after Vladimir Lenin, died after having a stroke at age 74. He hadn't been in the best of health since the war ended. He was a heavy smoker and suffered from high blood pressure. He'd also had a previous stroke in May 1945 and then a heart attack later that October. There's some controversy over whether or not he was murdered, poisoned by his secret police chief, who was a serial rapist and murderer, and who a few months later was executed for treason and other charges unrelated to Stalin's death. Stalin had ruled the USSR as an authoritarian dictator for 29 years, since 1924. On June 19, 1953, Americans Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were executed at Sing Sing prison in Ossining, New York, by the federal government for being spies and passing information about jet propulsion engines and nuclear weapon designs to the Soviet Union. Protesters in 1951 argued their conviction was due to anti-Semitism, and several prominent celebrities, such as Albert Einstein and the artist Pablo Picasso, begged President Truman to pardon the couple, and even Pope Pius XII asked President Eisenhower to spare their lives in 1953. The Rosenbergs were the only civilians executed by the government for spying during the Cold War. Pluto went inbounds to stay on May 27, 1953. This concluded Pluto's last out-of-bound north period for the next several thousand years. Shortly after Pluto was back inbounds, Queen Elizabeth II's coronation occurred on June 2, 1953. It was the first televised coronation in British history and drew an audience of more than 20 million BBC viewers in the UK, ushering in the modern age of the monarchy. In the US, more than 85 million people watched the highlights. The next month, on July 27, 1953, the Korean War ended with an armistice, which also demarcated the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, close to the 38th parallel as a buffer between the two countries. The armistice was just an agreement to end hostilities. It was not a full-fledged peace treaty, and to this day there still hasn't been a peace treaty, though China signed a peace treaty with South Korea in 1992. 2 years after the Korean armistice, when Pluto was firmly back in bounds on April 5, 1955, Winston Churchill resigned as Prime Minister of the UK due to ailing health, though he continued to serve as a Member of Parliament till his death. He died at age 90 on January 24, 1965, 10 years after he resigned from his second term as Prime Minister. Harry S. Truman, the 33rd President of the United States and the other World War II Big Three Allied leader of this Pluto out-of-bounds north period, died in his home state of Missouri on December 26, 1972 at age 88. Emperor Hirohito of Japan, or the Axis powers side, died on January 7, 1989. Hirohito was 87 years old and had reigned for 63 years, the longest of any emperor in Japan, and one of the longest reigning monarchs in the world. Please watch for my next video on Pluto's critical cycles when he journeys across the equator north to south at 0 degrees declination from 1986 to 1989. Same themes, same nations, different players.
Thanks for watching Astromantic.
See you then.